The year was 1944. The war in Europe had reached its fevered crescendo, a symphony of thunder that rattled cities into dust and left fields scarred with tank tracks and shell craters. For most of the world, this was a story told in the clamor of men, generals at maps, soldiers in trenches, pilots above the clouds. But on the ground, along the endless back roads and makeshift encampments of war, another story simmered quietly, almost invisible until the moment it was revealed. It was a story that belonged to women. And to those who saw it for the first time, it could be more disorienting than the sudden roar of artillery. Prisoners of war arrived in waves, carried by defeat, fatigue, and the collapse of the Reich's promises. Among them were women, secretaries once attached to German command posts, Red Cross auxiliaries, and sometimes merely civilians swept up in the retreat. Their uniforms were often ill-fitting, their dignity bruised by surrender, their eyes heavy with disbelief. They had grown up in a nation where a woman's role was rigidly defined, praised for quiet devotion and sacrifice, tethered always to the orbit of men. The Führer himself had promised them honor as mothers and as workers, but never as equals, never astride the iron beasts of modernity. So when these German women POWs first glimpsed the American camps, they expected the familiar rhythm of power. Men barking orders, men driving machines, men deciding the fates of others. Instead, the air was punctuated by a sound they did not expect, the low, pulsing thrum of engines, steady as a heartbeat yet wild as thunder on the horizon. Dust rose from the camp roads, and through it emerged a vision so disorienting it seemed almost a hallucination. Women, in crisp American uniforms, riding Harley-Davidson WLA motorcycles. The machines themselves were intimidating, broad-shouldered beasts of steel painted in military olive. Each one bore the weight of war, saddlebags for dispatches, scuffed pedals, headlights sometimes taped over in cross patterns to avoid enemy sighting. But it was not the machines that froze the German POWs. It was the riders. The women sat tall, confident, gripping the handlebars with gloves worn smooth from use. Their boots hit the ground with assurance as they leaned to maneuver, their hair hidden beneath helmets or scarves, their posture firm, unyielding. The exhaust coughed smoke as the Harleys rumbled past, and in their wake, silence fell, not because the sound was gone, but because the sight had shattered expectation. For the German women, it was unthinkable. In their country, motorcycles had been symbols of masculine daring, tethered to the image of soldiers or rebellious young men. To see American women commanding these machines, not as an aberration but as part of the war effort itself, felt like an intrusion from another universe. Some stared with disbelief, lips parted, words stuck in their throats. Others whispered questions to one another, unsure whether to laugh or recoil. Were these really women? Were they permitted, encouraged, to ride such machines? The shock was deeper than novelty. It was a confrontation with the very ideology they had been raised under. For years, Nazi propaganda had painted the American woman as frivolous, decadent, corrupted by jazz and cosmetics, unfit for the seriousness of war. And yet here they were, faces streaked with dust, uniforms creased from long hours, women who carried dispatches through dangerous roads where ambushes lurked, women whose confidence made them indistinguishable from their male counterparts in duty if not in form. American servicewomen, particularly those in the Women's Army Corps, had been trained to handle the Harley-Davidson WLAs as dispatch riders. They were not soldiers in the traditional sense. Most were not armed with rifles or sent into frontline combat, but their work carried risk all the same. They braved shellfire and unpredictable roads to deliver messages, to keep armies connected in moments when radio silence was essential. Each ride was a gamble against fate, and yet they mounted their machines with a matter-of-factness that spoke of training, of determination, and of a society willing, however reluctantly, to expand the borders of what women could do. Among the POWs, emotions mingled uneasily. Some felt a sting of humiliation. If American women could ride like this, command machines with such authority, then what did that say of German women who had been told their highest honor lay in bearing sons for the Reich? Others felt something closer to awe, a quiet spark they dared not speak aloud. To see a woman moving with such freedom was to glimpse a horizon beyond their own confinement. And in the silence of their captivity, that sight whispered promises of a world reordered. The war itself was a theater of contrasts. On the one side, Germany crumbling under the weight of Allied advances, cities reduced to rubble, an ideology fraying at its edges. On the other, America presenting an image of abundance, of modernity carried across the ocean in steel, gasoline, and sheer confidence. Nowhere was this contrast more personal, more intimate, than in the sight of those women riders. It was not just America's tanks or bombers that impressed the POWs. It was America's willingness to place its daughters in the saddle of a Harley and trust them to carry the weight of war. The days in the camps dragged on, measured by meals of rations and the distant echoes of artillery. But the image of the riders lingered. Some German women tried to dismiss it, calling them stunt girls or masqueraders, insisting it was some trick of American vanity. Yet their eyes betrayed the truth, disbelief shaded by fascination. Others could not shake the memory, replaying it in the quiet of night. The sound of the engine became a phantom, a pulse reminding them of a freedom they had never known. It is easy, from the distance of decades, to underestimate the weight of such a sight. But in that moment, war had become more than a clash of armies. It was a clash of worlds, of possibilities. For women raised to see themselves as background figures in history, the presence of American riders was not merely surprising, it was destabilizing. It suggested that power could be redrawn, that roles could shift, that the war itself might be ending not only a political regime but a social order. And yet, behind the awe, there was also fear. Change was a double-edged sword. To admire the riders was, in some sense, to admit that the Reich had been wrong, that the sacrifices demanded of German women had been twisted toward ends that denied them fuller lives. It was easier to mock, to scoff, than to admit such truths. Still, the sound of the Harleys persisted, a stubborn reminder that another way was possible. The American women themselves seldom paused to think of the impact they had on the prisoners who watched them. For them, the Harley was a tool, a duty. They tightened straps, checked engines, shared cigarettes in the brief pauses between rides. They laughed when the bikes stalled in mud, cursed when the engines backfired, grinned at one another when the missions were successful. In their camaraderie and their competence, they embodied something larger than themselves, a living argument that women could ride, could serve, could bear the dust and danger of war with the same grit as men. The German POWs could not look away. And perhaps that was the greatest shock of all. Not that American women rode motorcycles. But that once seen, the image could not be unseen. It lodged in the mind like a fragment of shrapnel, small but impossible to ignore. One evening, as the sun sank and painted the camp fences in long shadows, a group of POW women stood together as the familiar growl of engines rose again. Through the dust came the riders, visors low, headlights glowing faintly in the twilight. The POWs said nothing, only watched. For a brief instant, one of the Americans glanced their way, eyes meeting eyes across the gulf of war. She gave the smallest nod, barely more than an acknowledgement, before the Harleys roared past. It was nothing, a flicker, a gesture, a rider acknowledging the existence of those who had once been enemies. And yet for the women behind the fence, it was everything. It was proof that the world was wider than they had been told, that the roles of women could stretch beyond kitchens and offices, beyond the limits of propaganda. The sight of a woman astride a Harley-Davidson WLA had already unsettled them. That single nod made it undeniable. What the prisoners could not yet know was that the sound of those engines was more than the rhythm of the war. It was the sound of change approaching, of a post-war world already beginning to take shape. And it would not be long before the lessons carried by those riders, unspoken, undeniable, would force them to confront a truth far more disorienting than defeat itself. The war was not only a clash of armies, it was a contest of symbols. In the mud-caked boots of infantrymen and the steel hulls of tanks, nations expressed their power. But sometimes, the sharpest contrast revealed itself in the unexpected. For the German women who lingered in American camps, the motorcycle was one such revelation. The Harley-Davidson WLA was not merely a machine, it was a statement, one that rode louder than speeches, that rumbled with meanings neither side could ignore. The Harley had been born in Milwaukee's factories, a beast forged not for show but for endurance. It carried a 45 cubic inch engine, reliable enough to roar across fields gutted by artillery. Its olive paint was chipped and scarred by use, its frame heavy enough to withstand the pounding of rough roads. More than 90,000 had been sent overseas, each one a fragment of America carried across the ocean, a reminder that industry and freedom could be harnessed in steel and gasoline. Soldiers called it the Liberator, and the name fit. It was a machine of movement, a messenger of momentum, and in the hands of women, it became something far greater. American servicewomen did not see themselves as heroes. They were dispatch riders, clerks, drivers, mechanics, each filling a gap left by men at the front. But the Harley gave them a kind of stage presence no uniform or rank could provide. Riding meant speed, danger, and trust. It meant carrying messages across miles where radio silence ruled, where one mistake could invite ambush. When they swung their legs over the saddle and kicked the starter, they entered a role as old as the cavalry and as modern as mechanized war. They did it without ceremony, but to the eyes of their captives, they seemed like emissaries from another world. One rider, Private Evelyn Carter, had grown up in Ohio, her father a machinist, her evenings filled with the smell of oil and iron. She had learned to ride young, sneaking onto her brother's motorcycle until balance became second nature. In the Army, that childhood defiance became a skill polished into service. Now, she rode the WLA with a steadiness that drew stares from the men around her, though she pretended not to notice. For her, the road was the only focus. The feel of the handlebars beneath her gloves, the vibration in her thighs, the wind cutting through the static of war. To ride was to prove she belonged, not just in uniform, but in history itself. Among the German women who watched her was Ingrid, a secretary once attached to a Luftwaffe command post. Her hands, trained for typewriters and carbon paper, had grown callous during captivity, but her mind still clung to the old rhythms of hierarchy. She had never ridden a motorcycle. The very idea seemed foreign, frivolous. And yet, each time Evelyn's Harley thundered past, Ingrid felt a hollow ache beneath her sternness. It was not envy alone, but a gnawing sense of betrayal, that she had been denied the chance even to imagine such freedom. The Reich had promised discipline, pride, and security, but not this. Not the exhilaration of steel and speed under the command of one's own hands. The two women never spoke. Their lives were divided by language, uniform, and the invisible wall of war. But their eyes met once, a glance that lingered longer than either expected. For Evelyn, it was nothing more than curiosity, a flicker of acknowledgement before turning back to duty. For Ingrid, it was a wound opening. In that brief connection, she saw not an enemy but a possibility, a version of womanhood she had never been allowed to consider. The conflict between them was silent, internal, but no less sharp than gunfire. Ingrid clung to the remnants of what she had been taught, that women found honor in sacrifice, in silence, in obedience. Yet every roar of the Harley chipped away at that certainty. Was it obedience that carried messages through enemy fire? Was it silence that tightened straps and steadied hands at 40 miles per hour on broken roads? She could not reconcile the two. For the Americans, the motorcycles were practical, part of the machinery of war. But for the Germans, they became mirrors. Each ride forced them to see what they were not, what they could not be within the boundaries of their homeland. Some mocked, whispering that the riders looked ridiculous, that the machines were oversized toys. Yet their laughter was brittle, a cover for the envy they could not admit. Others, braver in their honesty, confessed to one another in hushed tones that perhaps this was the future, this fusion of machine and woman, of freedom and responsibility. Evelyn knew nothing of their thoughts. Her world was the road ahead, the engine beneath, the orders she carried in her satchel. Yet one evening, as she coasted to a halt near the camp fence, she caught the sight of Ingrid standing apart from the others, her eyes fixed not on the machine but on the rider herself. There was no hostility in that gaze, only a strange hunger, as though Ingrid were trying to memorize every detail. The way Evelyn's boots pressed against the pedals, the way her hands gripped with certainty, the way her body seemed at ease with the roar of the engine. Evelyn looked back, offering no smile, no words. But in that silence, the gulf between them narrowed for a heartbeat. The war was ending. Rumors of Germany's collapse rippled through the camps. The Reich was shrinking, surrender was near, and with it came the uncertainty of what tomorrow would hold. For the German women, defeat meant not only loss of nation but collapse of identity. Who were they, if the world itself was about to be remade? And what role would women play in the ruins that remained? The Harleys answered in their own way. Every time the engines growled to life, they announced that the future would not look like the past. That women could ride into it not as shadows, but as participants. The message was unintentional, but no less powerful. It unsettled, inspired, and terrified in equal measure. On the last night before their transfer, the POWs gathered near the wire as the riders prepared for another dispatch. The engines fired one by one, coughing smoke, filling the dusk with thunder. Evelyn mounted her Harley, tightening her straps, adjusting her helmet. Across the fence, Ingrid stood rigid, her fingers gripping the wire until they left red marks on her skin. The others muttered, some in disdain, some in awe, but Ingrid said nothing. Her eyes were locked on the rider, the machine, the image she knew would never leave her. Evelyn revved the engine, the machine growling like a caged beast. She glanced toward the fence one last time, her visor reflecting the fading light. And then, with a twist of her wrist, the Harley leapt forward, kicking up dust that blurred the air between them. Ingrid closed her eyes, breathing in the smell of gasoline, of smoke, of change itself. When she opened them again, the rider was gone, the sound of the engine fading into the night. But the silence that followed was not the silence of absence. It was the silence of realization. The war was ending, but something else had begun, a story not yet written, a future not yet defined. For Ingrid, the sight had burned too deeply to be dismissed. She knew she would carry it long after the camps were emptied and the fences torn down. The Harley was not just a motorcycle. It was freedom in motion, a rebellion given wheels. It was proof that the world had shifted, and that she, whether ready or not, had shifted with it. The climax did not arrive with gunfire or sirens, but with a single roaring machine tearing through the dusk, leaving behind a silence so charged it felt like prophecy. For the German women, that silence was louder than victory or defeat. It was the sound of everything they thought they knew beginning to collapse. And as the dust settled, they realized the future was already arriving, astride a Harley-Davidson.